Hi everybody, today I'm going to be doing an updated video on corsets and ribs. Specifically rib removal or rib resection is the proper term for it, because so many people have messaged me and asked me what I think of this procedure, what I think of Pixee Fox, who had it done in 2015, and more recently Rodrigo Alves, also known as the Human Ken doll, had it done I think in the past couple of weeks. I think it was a video back in 2012 where I erroneously said that there was no recorded cases of anybody past or present who had ever surgically broken or removed their floating ribs for aesthetic, like purely cosmetic purposes, and I turned out to be mistaken. I originally got this information from chapter 10 of Victorian Secrets by Sarah A. Chrisman, and also from Valerie Steele's book here, The Corset, A Cultural History, which was published back in 2001. So at the time, I couldn't find any official publications from the 19th century regarding elective cosmetic surgery to remove the floating ribs. And page 73 and 74 of this book here, it says, it would have been very difficult for a woman to find a trained surgeon willing to undertake such a hazardous operation for cosmetic purposes. Histories of plastic surgery do not mention rib removal. Rumors of movie stars having their lower ribs removed still circulate. It would now theoretically be possible to perform such an operation, and someone, somewhere, may have done it. But there's never been anything published about it. No one has owned up to performing such a procedure, much less having had one, says Dr. John E. Sherman of Cornell University's Medical School. To risk your life, your ribs are right there up against your lung tissue, for what would be a relatively minor change in aesthetics would be crazy. And it goes on a little bit longer, and it does mention that people who wear corsets, particularly conical rib corsets, and particularly those who tight lace, especially like Cathie Jung. It says here, people often ask Catherine Jung if she has had her ribs removed, and her husband always replies that it isn't necessary. So again, this book was written in 2001, and times have changed. And once again, this was obviously in context to rib resection being used as a purely cosmetic procedure. Nobody doubts that rib resection has been used for various medical purposes. For instance, if somebody breaks a rib from an injury, or if they have a congenital condition that led to severely deformed and rotated ribs, and there's a chance that these ribs might never be corrected. In the case of broken ribs, they might never heal properly. Sometimes the surgeon believes that it's better for the patient to just have it removed. Or if somebody gets cancer that spreads to the bone and it is necessary to remove the bones or amputate them to save the patient's life, then obviously the bones can be removed. The ribs can also be removed to use in reconstructive surgery in smaller parts of the body. A common place where these bones are used is the face and jawline, and the floating ribs have quite a bit of cartilage in there as well that they can use. So if somebody has oral cancer and they have part of their jaw removed, or if they have a very bad injury and their jaw was just shattered, they can use bones from also the fibula and the legs, but often the ribs as well, to reconstruct the face, because using your own tissue has a lower chance of rejection or reaction to titanium plates, for instance. So you have a better chance of healing without these post-operative complications or immunity problems. Sometimes the very upper ribs are removed as well for medical purposes. So the very first rib, which is very close to the clavicle or collarbone, can be removed if it causes things like blood clots in the neck or the shoulder, thoracic outlet syndrome, Raynaud's syndrome, other medical complications. Some people actually are born with vestigial cervical ribs, meaning tiny little bones or ribs that grow out of their neck bones that aren't supposed to be there. So they can just get those removed so that it doesn't cause any complications. There are also open surgeries where the ribs are deliberately, temporarily broken or removed so that the doctors are able to get at the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and then usually they put the ribs back together again. However, I still believe that rib removal as an elective and aesthetic surgery, a cosmetic surgery in the 1800s was absurd. I don't believe that there are millions of women from the 1800s that removed their floating ribs for the sake of vanity. This was a time before anesthetic was able to be calibrated based on a person's size and weight. So depending on the amount of ether or chloroform that was administered to the patient, they may either wake up in the middle of surgery or they would never wake up again. Puncturing a lung and causing it to collapse is a very real risk, both back then and today, because you're working so closely to the area, just as the doctor said in Valerie Steele's book. Also, people didn't know about blood types until the year 1900, so if you lost too much blood and needed a transfusion, it was a game of roulette if you could find a donor that would match your blood type. Also, germ theory was only starting to be accepted around the 1880s, and so before this time, many surgeons would not sterilize their tools or even wash their hands. And even if a physician was an early adopter of germ theory and did learn the importance of hand washing, it would still be around 50 years before penicillin would be discovered in 1928. And penicillin wasn't officially medical distributed until closer to 1940. So post-surgical infections and complications and fatalities associated with any surgical procedure would still be extremely high. Remember that surgical procedures were so feared that even those who needed life-saving surgery, even as recently as World War I, say if they had needed a limb amputated, many opted for death instead because they didn't want to go through first the traumatic experience of the surgery and the post-operative complications. So the idea that, thousands or millions of women in the Victorian time voluntarily opted for rib removal as a cosmetic surgery around this time, it's simply ridiculous. It's just not based in fact. And a lot of these just really crazy rumors around the Victorian period, the surgery, in addition to, for instance, the young girls being forced to tight lace to like 12 inches in circumference by strict headmistresses and the like. These were actually stories from 19th century fetish magazines. People often forget that fan fiction, fetish fiction, these types of things they existed a few centuries ago. Not every surviving publication from this era is documented fact. And actually, if you want to learn more about the gruesome history of surgery, there's a great documentary that I recommend called Blood and Guts, A History of Surgery. So we know that as of 2001, rib resection as an elective cosmetic surgery was not something that was generally medically documented, but from my research, around 2006, 2007, 2008, around that area, it began being discussed as a procedure for trans women to create a more narrow torso and waistline in various forums. And there is a video from 2011 by Dr. Aaron Stone right here on YouTube performing a tummy tuck, liposuction, and rib removal on one patient to create a smaller waist. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll link it up in the cards or down in the description below. But of course, we can't have a video on rib removal without talking about arguably one of the most famous cases of cosmetic rib resection, which was performed on Pixee Fox, who is another corset enthusiast. So for her Living Cartoon project, she had, I believe, 3 pairs of ribs removed back in 2015. And actually, according to her surgeon, her ribs were not fully removed, but rather more or less shortened. So the 2 lowest ribs are floating ribs, and they don't wrap, like fully around the rib cage to begin with. If you look at a skeleton, the bottom 2 sets of ribs are kind of like this. So they can swing in and out. They're not really attached to anything at the front. So it seems from an interview with Pixee Fox's doctor in 2016 that he shortened her ribs by just removing those little cartilage tips on the sides to make her waist more narrow, but he still left part of the ribs in the back around the kidney area. And again, there is a short video of him explaining that himself, which if you're interested in watching, I'll link it up in the cards and down in the description below. And more recently, just in the past couple of weeks, there's been news of another documented case on another person who's very famous for their plastic surgeries, Rodrigo Alves, also known as the Human Ken doll. And if I'm not mistaken, I read that he also aired this cosmetic surgery on his Instagram. And he was also allowed to take home his removed ribs in a jar to keep as evidence of having the procedure done. So even though the surgery is becoming more well known from the media coverage of it, the procedure is still invasive, such that most doctors would not consider performing it. Even Pixee Fox and Rodrigo Alves say that they had to kind of look around to find somebody who would be willing to do it. Some other people on forums said that they opted to fly to South America to have it performed because they had a hard time finding somebody in Europe or North America who was willing to do it. Obviously, this surgery carries all the same risks as other major surgeries, risk of reaction to anesthesia, infection, sepsis, problems healing, and there's still the risk of collapsing a lung during this surgery, and then you'd have to reinflate it. And a lot of people asked me to do this video in the context of my personal opinions regarding the recent stories about it, what I think of the procedure in general, what I think of Pixee Fox or Rodrigo Alves. I don't like to be involved in drama, and I find the question to be not very classy. Of course, the surgery is not average, but Pixee herself said that she was never going for average. It's a surgery that I would never consider for myself. I would not recommend removing ribs purely for aesthetic reasons because I don't find it to be necessary. But really and truly, it's not my place to say to other people, hey, like, you're not allowed to do that with your body, because their body is not mine to begin with, so I don't really have a say in what they do. And especially being in the corset industry, where it is really, really difficult to spread this idea that corsets can enhance your self-esteem without putting down your natural body type, and that corsets can be body positive. And it's really an expression of bodily autonomy, that you can do whatever you want with your own body and you don't have to listen to what other people tell you. It would be especially hypocritical of me to say that Pixee or Rodrigo can't do that with their body. Obviously, Pixee had done a lot of research into this. She was aware of the risks. She got many opinions before going through with it, which is evident of the fact that so many people decided not to take her on as a patient for this surgery before she finally found one that would. I'm less familiar with the human Ken doll's experience with the surgery. There might be more information coming out about it in the next few weeks or months, perhaps, because the story is still relatively new. But regarding Pixie's experience, I've never heard her say anything along the lines of, hey, everybody, you need to do this. Like, she always says, I'm doing right by me, you should all do right by you. So I can't really fault her for saying that. The procedure is finished. I'm happy that it seems to have gone well, that she didn't experience any complications with the surgery. It's still nothing that I would ever consider for myself, but that doesn't mean that people like Pixee or Rodrigo are less deserving of respect than other people. That said, in the time that I've been in the corset industry, hundreds, possibly thousands of people have asked me how they can make their rib cage look smaller. And it is entirely possible to achieve a small corseted waist without surgery. It's entirely possible to actually shrink your floating ribs in a little bit and make it more conical without surgery. So again, it's 2018, 17 years after this book was published. So Cathie Jung has now been wearing corsets for some 40 years and has a 15-inch waist underneath her corsets. If you look at her x-rays, you see that she has all 12 sets of ribs. They just contoured and formed over decades of training. You can see the same rib tapering in some skeletons of women who waist trained in the 1800s. And even Rebecca Gibson's studies on impoverished French women in the 19th century showed that they experienced some tapering of the ribs as well. So once again, it's very possible to achieve a small waist, even a quite extreme conical rib silhouette with corsets while still keeping all of your ribs. But it does take a lot of patience. It takes many years, possibly decades for some. It requires that you have some flexibility to your rib cage to begin with. There are some people out there who have very rigid, inflexible ribs. You put like an ounce of pressure on them and they're more likely to bruise than have their ribs swing in and outwards. So for those people, unfortunately, I'm not sure what can be done. I don't know if those people could achieve results in, say, like 20 or 40 years like Cathie Jung. Some other people like myself, I have very flexible ribs, so I'm able to wear a conical rib corset, and my ribs just kind of accommodate that. And regarding this rumor that a lot of Victorian women had very conical rib cages due to surgery, please let's put that myth to rest. And there's a pretty sizable number of surviving photographs from the Victorian and Edwardian eras that have evidence of editing. It's basically an early form of Photoshop where they painted over the waist to make women's waists look more extreme, more conical, smaller than they really were. And another person on YouTube, Karolina, did a great video on this. So I will link that video up in the cards or down in the description below. But in conclusion, I just want to come back around to correct what I said in that previous video back in 2012 or 2013 or so. Yes, rib removal is a real surgery. It's used more commonly for correcting pre-existing medical problems or for reconstructive surgery on other parts of the body. than it is for cosmetic purposes in and of itself. It can be performed as a cosmetic procedure on its own, but that is still rare. It is more documented only in the past 10 years or so, and most surgeons do not recommend it. It's not something I would consider either. And it was certainly not a thing in the Victorian era. There were just too many risks, and the medicine was not refined enough at that point for the surgery to be considered, viable, to have a high success rate. So I hope this cleared up some common misconceptions about rib removal or rib resection. There are truths and myths around this procedure back in the 1800s and today. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comment down below. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it and you found it informative or educational, because it really helps my channel out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.